Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy that you've joining us for this lesson today on You Have Seen Him is the title of the lesson. It's session 11 in your quarterly if you have it, which is page 100. And it's going to be discussing John chapter 9, verses 24 through 28. But we'll discuss a little bit in chapter 9 before we get into those verses. You know, there's lots of us who take photos all through our life of things that we liked seeing, things that were important to us, our kids, and whatever. And each of them have a story to tell. You know, some photos can carry greater significance than others. And these are especially the ones that are like a once-in-a-lifetime scene, or your first child doing something funny, or anything that seems to be very important to us. And sometimes we can get frustrated when we show them to other people and they don't especially see what we see in them. And, you know, they can't imagine the image that they're seeing and what we see into it. But we know that sometimes people just can't see. You know, now, the story today is going to be about a man who was born blind but was granted sight by Jesus, while some who had sight became blinded to the truth and tried to discredit him. And to better understand this, we're going to go into understanding the context. And that's going to be from chapter 9, verse 1 through 41 in the book of John. You know, following his confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus left the temple. And as he's leaving, he encountered a man who had been born blind. See, now his disciples, they posed a question to Jesus. You know, who sinned here, the man or his parents? They didn't quite understand. And at that time, the Jews did think that if somebody was born with some difficulty or something, that either them or their parents had sinned. And that was the case with most Jewish people who lived during the Old Testament times, okay? So with this, we can see that they had limited insight. And disciples had limited insight. See, they were looking for a cause and effect. And certainly sin results in God's chastisement of us, but not all illnesses are triggered by sin. So Jesus revealed that God allows some conditions to occur to demonstrate his glory. And that's what we got to remember. Things like this, God can demonstrate his glory in. So we can see that the scribes and the Pharisees, they were kind of self-righteous. They had this superiority about them. And they rebuked Jesus for healing a man on the Sabbath. That was breaking their law. That's breaking the law of Moses. Where they didn't realize that one greater than Moses was there. So let's talk a little bit more here. See, Jesus healed the man. He picked up some dirt, spit in it, made some mud, and put it on his eyes. That was considered working on the Sabbath in the Old Testament law, okay? And told him to go wash at the pool. The man did as Jesus told him to. And guess what? His sight was restored. Now, the scribes and Pharisees went to the man and said, who did this? And when did they do it? And how did they do it? They broke the law. And the man says, I do not know. All I know is that before I couldn't see, but now I see. After the scribes and Pharisees had talked to this guy, Jesus looked the man up and revealed himself as the Messiah to the man. You see, the man believed Jesus and received a greater blessing than physical sight. When people are spiritually blind, it's because of their hearts. It's not because they can't see, it's because of their hearts. Okay, let's go on into exploring the text now. We're going to do verses 24 and 25, and we're going to see, I can see. So it's second time they summoned the man who had been blind and told him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered, whether or not he's a sinner I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. Now, this is after Jesus had healed the blind man. The scribes and Pharisees were talking to him. And this is what the blind man said. We can see that in connecting this story between sin and suffering, the Jews believed that the person was suffering, he must have sinned. As I stated before in understanding the context. And if a person sinned, he will suffer. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 28 states that if the Israelites walked in disobedience, the Lord would afflict them with blindness. Well, by the time the New Testament had been written, the Jews had come to believe if someone was born blind, either the parents or the newborn must have sinned. And that's where they got this, that it was sin that caused this. See, Jesus and his disciples saw a beggar who was blind from birth. Now, Jesus explained to his disciples that the man had been born blind, not because of sin, but so that God's work might be displayed in him, so God's glory could shine. So we can see the Pharisees interrogated the man after he had been healed. And not getting the right answers, after they interrogated him, they sought his parents. And fearful of being excluded from the synagogue, the father and mother simply attested to the fact that their son was born blind, but was now able to see. So then the Pharisees turned their attention once again to the man who could now see, and then interrogated him again. You see, the religious leaders gave the man an imperative. Give glory to God. Don't give it to Jesus. He's a sinner. Give it to God. Well, they were instructing him to give credit to God rather than Jesus. Now, this was a demand that the man honor God. They wanted him to honor God with truthful words rather than continue what they thought was so obvious, a lie about how he had been healed. Now, next we can see the Pharisees emphatically declared about Jesus. We know that this man's a sinner. Now, the basis for this statement was the fact that Jesus had healed the blind man on the Sabbath, which meant he certainly was not from God in their eyes. Like I said, the Jewish interpretation of law would allow someone to perform an action to save a person's life on the Sabbath if the individual was in danger. But to mix saliva and mud together and make mud, no, that was like work. You couldn't do that. That was prohibited on the Sabbath. To violate the Sabbath in such a way was seen as a rebellion against God. You see, the Pharisees were certain they were on solid footing when they referred to Jesus as a sinner. Can you believe that? They thought they was on solid footing. The man who they were questioning stood his ground. He refused to say whether the one who had healed him was a sinner. Instead, he stubbornly held to and proclaimed the one fact he knew for certain. I was blind, and now I see. You see, Jesus had moved him from the realm of darkness to light. Let's look at the next couple of verses here. Let's look at verses 26 through 27. It says, then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? The man told him, I already told you, he said, and you didn't listen. So he'd already told them all this, and they were still questioning. See, the Pharisees maintained their united front. They asked him exactly what happened. But he was unfazed by their authority and social importance. This beggar stood up to one of the most respected, established, and intimidating Jewish groups of his day. He said, I already told you, and you didn't listen to me. That was a sign of disrespect toward them. The beggar, though, he was not finished talking to him. He had more to tell him. He delivered his strongest punch. You don't want to become his disciples, do you? Boy, that's throwing it back at the Pharisees, wasn't it? Because I think they asked Nicodemus if he was one of his disciples. Now, they asked about everybody who was following Jesus. So you one of his disciples? Well, let's look at verses 28 and 29. They ridiculed him. You're that man's disciple, but we're Moses' disciple. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man, we don't know where he's from. This is an amazing thing, the man told him. You don't know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. Now, these two verses get at the heart of the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders. You see, they claimed that their authority came from God. After all, the Lord had spoken with Moses face to face. But what these leaders failed to understand was that Jesus was God in the flesh. He was not competing against Moses. In fact, Moses had written about him in the books of Moses. He had written about Jesus. And that's just, they couldn't understand it. They were spiritually blind. The man had hit a nerve when he told them what he told them. Trying to regain their footing, they mocked the uneducated beggar. You're that man's disciple. Then they stated why they considered themselves superior. We're Moses' disciples. In saying we know, the Pharisees were maintaining their united and dogmatic front. The Pharisees knew where Moses' words came from. God had spoken to Moses himself. Where Jesus had come from, wherever that was, comparatively had to be completely insignificant. Therefore, they thought his words were not important. In verses 30 through 34, it says, this is an amazing thing, the man told him. You don't know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. You were born entirely in sin, they replied, and are you trying to teach us? Then they threw him out. The beggar was teaching them. He was definitely teaching them, but their hard hearts had blinded them to the simple truth. You see, the beggar had proved himself well versed in Jewish teachings. He pointed out that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he does listen to God-fearing people who obey him. You know, the Pharisees likely agreed with what the man was saying so far, but the healed man continued pointing out that the miracle he had experienced was unique in all of history. He concluded by stating that for Jesus to have done what he did, he had to be from God. See, the Pharisees' attack on Jesus failed because the evidence could not be refuted. A man born blind was conversing with them with fully capable sight. He maintained if this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. See, this kind of trapped the Pharisees by logic. So they responded by attacking the man himself. They hurled at the beggar the accusations that they had made about Jesus. Both were sinners. They went further, saying that the man had been born entirely in sin, the possibility the disciples had raised. Remember, the disciples had been talking about that back in the verse 24 and 25. Having nothing else in their arsenal, they threw him out, meaning out of the synagogue. He had just totally broke their story in two. of no use was their story. You see, the Pharisees had become so engulfed in their own anger that they failed to remember God had promised that the blind would receive sight at the dawn of the Messiah age. Rather than recognize the moment for what it was, they focused on preserving their pity, their status, and authority, even if doing so meant they failed to recognize the Messiah, the Son of God. You know, people may debate theological points, but they cannot deny the change Jesus works in us when we come to Him. Let's go to verses 35 through 37. Now 35 through 36. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and when he found him, he asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" he asked. You know, when we read the other Gospels, we see more instances of Jesus healing blind people more than any other miracle. Yet what Jesus did with this man who had been born blind was unique. He afterwards looked until he found him. Jesus usually didn't go find the people he had healed, but he did this man. And as he calmly did, Jesus began the conversation with a question. To believe did not mean simply to accept facts about the Son of Man. Jesus was asking the man if he put his trust in him, the Son of Man, for forgiveness and salvation. Now, the term Son of Man was a favorite self-designation for Jesus. See, Daniel used the term to refer to Messiah, echoing that the usage, Jesus used the title to emphasize both his humanity and his identity as the Messiah. You know, maybe the blind man had earlier heard Jesus refer to himself as the light of the world. Yet, after he was healed, he referred to Jesus by name and later called him a prophet. What he did not know, however, was that Jesus was a long-awaited Son of Man. Now, the question, who is he, indicated the man was longing to place his faith in him and to leave behind the cultural and religious traditions of his day. The man was prepared to follow the Son of Man. Okay, let's look at the other two verses as we finish up here, which is 37 and 38. Jesus answered, "You have seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." "I believe, Lord," he said, and he worshiped him. See, Jesus could have responded, "I am he." Instead, he referred to the man's healing as one evidence of the Messiah's identity. You have seen him. He healed him from blindness, and now he was able to see. And lest there be any doubt to his meaning, Jesus told the man, "He is the one speaking with you right now." Jesus wanted the man to understand exactly who he was. Now, realizing Jesus was the Son of Man, the man responded in two ways. The first one was visible and the other not. First, he believed, meaning he accepted the truth of who Jesus was. Second, he worshiped Jesus right on the spot. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. This is the only occurrence in John's Gospel of someone worshiping Jesus before his crucifixion and resurrection. And the man's response is a reminder that worship is the natural response for anyone who has a life-changing experience with Jesus. The unnamed beggar had begun today both physically and spiritually blind. And all that changed because of his encounter with Jesus. When we encounter Jesus ourselves, we are able to see again ourselves. The blindness is taken, it's lifted from our eyes, and we can see. You know, as believers, we must examine our beliefs in light of the Scriptures. And then we can share with others the difference Jesus makes in our lives. And as believers, we must worship Jesus in faith and actions. If you can't see today, ask Jesus to come into your life, and he'll lift the veil from your eyes and bring you into the light. God bless you and have a great day.